accurate. And he says, well, you got anything to back that up with? I said, well, so I decided I'll make a talk on it. So this is cave radios. How do we know they're accurate? Well, obviously, I said so. And if that ain't good enough for you, well, some places you do a location and you drill a hole. And if you hit the cave, it must have been real good. And in fact, there's some caves like Glenwood Springs in Colorado where I've done a number of locations. So they all turned out well, must be good. Well, if you're not familiar with cave radios, it's a directional system, really. And you have a receiver or a beacon that's down in the cave, and both the beacon and the antenna on the surface are very similar. Usually they look sort of round or square. And in the cave, you go in, you put this down and level it up very nicely. And this puts out a magnetic field. And on the surface, you have a similar antenna, and it's very directional. And you can listen to the signal and swing this around and get a direction pointing at where the underground antenna is. So you wander around until you find it on the surface. This is what the cave team has to bring in, and I don't know, they always complain about how heavy it is. I don't know. It's science, guys. Well, this is what that magnetic field looks like if you were looking down on it from above. And when I'm wandering around on the surface, this is more or less the view I get. And in blue on this, that'd be one way when you hold your antenna, and it's parallel to these lines, magnetic lines, you don't get a signal. And so that's what I'm looking for when I'm wandering around on the surface. Is I hold up my antenna and swing it around and then go, I don't hear anything this way. So I know I'm pointed exactly at that station. So off I go. Whoop. Do you want it right away? Okay. Thank you. And if I move around on the surface with the green lines and plot out the directions, they'll intersect pretty closely at a point on the surface. And what I do is I move closer and closer and start, and eventually I'll get down to a point on the surface where I'll be pointed from here, I'll go over here, and I'll go over here, go over here, and then I'll move in a little bit closer, here, here, right here, and finally I'll get to the point exactly over it. So when I do that, the point where I can turn the antenna around and around, and I don't hear nothing. And that tells me that's the spot. There is that problem too. Well, one of the problems that they say about cave radios, well, it's not accurate because that field can be distorted. You know, this is a coil of wire. This is about 80 turns around, a very fine wire. Well, you know, maybe the wires are crooked, or maybe the form isn't perfectly circular, or maybe the geology is really bad and really screws up your magnetic lines of force. So what happens if I try going on the surface here and triangulate? Thank you, Henry. It's backwards. Here, I might say, oh, it's at some point over there. And over here, I might go, well, it's over this way, so this would be where I'd start looking, out here, because that's where the lines would intersect. Well, there's a way around that, is that instead of triangulating in, what you do is you wiggle your antenna around till you get nothing, can't hear anything, and then you walk in that direction. And what you're ending up doing is walking along a line, and you don't care which way it meanders back and forth, but if you follow that line, eventually you get to the point where you can turn it all around and get nothing. So even if it's a distorted field, you can still do an accurate location. But there's one problem with that, finding the direction, is I turn the antenna around, I hear nothing, and I know that it's pointed at the station. But what I don't know is, do I walk this way? Or do I go that way? And that ends up being another problem, which I sort of lump into observer bias. Because I've been out there doing locations, and I darn well know that that point is somewhere over there. So I'll walk over that way and walk over that way, and the signal will get fainter and fainter. And finally I'll go, oh, well, maybe it was the other direction. Well, here's a list of what some of those problems are. You know, the antenna might not be level. The antenna might be distorted. Maybe the rock around it has mineralization or just faults and joints in it that will distort the field. Can have operator bias. Can have operator error. As unlikely as that would seem. And you could also get a really bad survey of the cave, something that is so wildly off that when you go out on the surface, the range on these radios are maybe 1,500 feet or so. So if they have a 1,500-foot error in their survey, you're not even going to be in the ballpark and you won't hear anything. Now, that's not generally the case, but when you're going out 12 miles, that's maybe a little more likely. It could also be that the cave is too deep and you won't get a signal. And the other problem you might have is wind and brush that you have to thrash through. I can find exactly which way I should point to get a null, not hear anything, except if it's a real windy day and it blows my antenna off to the side. And then I won't be able to find that too well. Or if I'm thrashing through bushes that keep pushing it away in different directions. Well, sometimes there are reasons why I'm not doing a very good job on the surface. Not only does thunderstorms and such swamp out the noise of the radio, but it also sort of dampens my abilities. But I'd mentioned observer bias, and there are some ways around that I can use. One is, I think I know where that point is, and I do it a couple of times. Yeah, over there, yeah. Yep, gonna hit right on his head. Now I'm over here and go, gosh, where is it going to be? No, well, of course I already know it's over his head. So that's where I'm going to find that. And over here, oh well, boy, I've got 3 spots now that say it's right on his head. So I'm fooling myself when I do that. So what I'll do sometimes is I'll go, oh, I'll turn my back and do it this way, and then turn around and say, oh yeah, okay, that's really what it is. Or close my eyes and put on a blindfold. Okay, there are ways that I can do this on the surface and eliminate some of that observer bias. Well, this is one case where we did try and do it deeper than the radios could work at. This is Lake of the Clouds in Carlsbad, and it's a little over 1,000 feet deep. Well, what I've come up with is a way that I call a single blind test. In the sciences, they like to do, the gold standard is what they call a double blind test. And that's where the observer doesn't know what's going on, and neither does the patient. So that it's one way of finding out if you're being biased in some way. Well, I can't do that, a double blind, but I can do a single blind test. And so what I do with that is that I have them go into the cave, set up a station, and then I locate it on the surface. And then in the cave, I tell them, okay, now do another location, but move to another location. Something not very far away, within 50 feet or so. But don't tell me on the surface where you moved it to. So if they decide on the to move it 20 feet east, and I do a location on the surface, then we both survey it out, and I say, oh, I got it 18 feet to the east. And they say, oh, we got it 20 feet to the east. Well, that tells me that now I've done 2 locations, and they're within 2 feet. So that's pretty likely what my error is. And here's one over at Fort Stanton. As Henry mentioned, they put in a 40-foot shaft between 2 rooms in the cave. And this was on the surface above that, where we put in 4 or 5 radio location stations. This is the map of the area. This is Don Sawyer Hall, where the shaft started, and this is the passageway that comes off of Snowy River, and we located the shaft dig to be right there. And this is what it looked like on the surface above. The black are the surface locations of 4 points. And around each of those surface points are 1 foot diameter circles. The red shows what they surveyed in the cave. And so you can see that underground here, well, they were really only about 6 inches away on that one. On here, well, they may be a foot away. On this one, less than 6 inches. On this one, about 1.5 feet away. So by looking at all of those, I mean, you can be pretty darn sure that we're better than 1.5 feet at this depth. On this, it was about 100 feet, yeah, 100 to 120 feet. Well, I originally started doing this when we were working at Kartchner Caverns, and they needed to put some of the tunnels into the cave. And even though we had done a Sunto survey of the cave, done a theodolite survey of the cave, there was a gyro theodolite survey in the cave, and they still weren't quite sure they wanted to spend $1 million. And so we did a cave radiolocation also. And here's one, same thing, depth of 170 feet here, 1 foot diameter circles. You know, this one, well, it's within 6 inches. Wow, this one's off by 5 feet. This one's off by maybe 1 foot, 1.5 feet. This one's about 1 foot off. So, looks like one of them is probably bad. But even if you look at this and say, gee, we got a 3,000 foot long survey that goes there, and we pretty well, darn well know it's within 5 feet. And here's one I did at Carlsbad Caverns into Left-Hand Tunnel with a depth of 750 feet. And we were able to get a location that agrees within about 10 feet on this one. Another one at Fort Stanton Cave where the error on this is about 6 feet. On here, we had two stations on the surface I located, and I said they were about 1 foot apart, and they were actually 12.5 feet apart. So, what's going on with that one? But it was 250 feet deep, so. And this is one where I tell people to move the radio location to another spot. Sometimes, no, they do it, but they go, ha, let's mess with Bob's mind. Here's the location here. Okay, we moved it to another location. Exactly the same spot. And I'm sitting there up on the surface going, well, did they move it or didn't they move it? Or, mess with Bob's mind. Well, I've done this single blind technique in about 40 locations. And so I plotted them out, and here are all of the different points. And you can get a pretty good idea of how accuracy changes with depth. Well, on a lot of this, it does increase, or seems to increase slightly with depth, but not very much. And that's sort of surprising, because you'd think that if there were problems with this being non-level, the deeper it is, the bigger your error would be. And I don't know, it sort of looks like maybe that's not the case. Maybe there is, just the same amount of error no matter what the depth is, at least down to 200 feet or so. But what I use instead is this line, which is pretty much an envelope, and it says my accuracy is about 2% of the depth. And it's pretty unlikely. There's only 2 points above that line. So 2 out of 40, about a 5% chance that I'm not hitting a better than 2% error. So if I want to get a really accurate location, I can use the single blind technique, and it has the drawback of having to do 2 locations or more. And one problem you have with cave radios, as I mentioned in September, that we weren't able to do the location. But we sent in the team, and they said, we'll be at position at 5 o'clock after going out 10 miles of passageway. And so we set up on the surface at 5 o'clock. And actually at 5:15, the thunderstorm moved in. But anyhow, we're sitting out there in the rain, and we don't hear nothing. And that's one problem you have, coordinating what's going on the surface with what's going on underground. And we didn't really know until the next morning that they hadn't been able to reach their objective. And so for several hours, I'm wandering around in the rain on the surface and thinking, what'd I do wrong? What'd I do wrong? What's broken? What's not working? I hope everybody's all right in the cave. Well, my conclusion is, yeah, this works really pretty well. Now, I've only talked about horizontal errors. There's also, you can measure depth with a cave radio. But as I say here, it's, well, you do it differently, and it's not as accurate as horizontal, but, the deeper you go, the worse it gets. So, yeah, that's a whole nother bag of worms. On a horizontal, as I said, 2% of the depth. On figuring how deep that is, well, the one we were going to do at Fort Stanton was going to be 600 feet deep. I could probably, maybe, get that within 15%, tell you the elevation at the back, plus or minus 100 feet. Yeah, maybe it's a plus or minus 150 feet. Don't know. Not very accurate for doing depths. Well, one of the other things that I've discovered with cave radios is that It's a lot like quantum physics. In quantum physics, there's a rule that it's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can't be entirely sure where a particle is until you measure it. Well, cave radios are like that. You don't know where that location is until you measure it, and that's when the quantum field collapses into a single position. And I found exactly where that usually is. So, any questions?
Was Larry convinced?
Excuse me?
Was Larry Fish, was he convinced when he presented this?
I actually haven't presented this back to him yet. One of the other big people in cave radio is Brian Pease back east, and he actually designed the equipment that I used. He has also done an awful lot of locations, and so I've asked him if he had any other data that he would like to add to this, and see if we can really, come up with a, definitive answer, because this is all based on my work. Other people may have, different results, and let's make it as good as we can. Yes?
Yeah, have you tried this in lava, for lava tubes, and do you ever get distortion?
Yes, I have tried it in lava tubes, and no, it doesn't have any real problems. One of the things, we use low frequency for cave radios. How low a frequency? Well, if you measure the wavelength, cell phone, your wavelength is, like about a hand span. And that doesn't go through things very well, because even this room is very big, and it's got lots of room for those small waves to bounce around. So if you go to a lower frequency, that wavelength gets bigger. Well, how big does it get? Well, with this radio, wavelength's about 40 miles. And that's one of the reasons that when you're 1,000 feet down in a cave, 1,000 feet is pretty small compared to the wavelength that I'm using. And in fact, I have another cave radio that is even lower frequency, and the wavelength there is over 200 miles. So, any other questions? Yes?
So the smaller the wavelength, I'm assuming the less signal you'll get deeper into the
Yes. The smaller the wavelength, when it really starts shrinking down and gets really small, we call it light. And we know how that reflects around. I mean, you just can't see through walls with light. But, with a radio you can, and actually, one description of these is, how a transformer works? Because, you have two coils of wire, and you put a current through one, and you can induce a current in the other one. Well, some people say cave radios are like that, because I have a beacon down in the cave, which is a coil of a bunch of wires, and it puts out a magnetic field, and then I have another one on the surface, and the one in the cave induces that signal in the one on the surface. And that's why I keep talking about magnetic lines rather than, a radio field. Any other questions? You're sure? This is fascinating stuff. Okay.